Hi, good morning, everyone, or later on, good afternoon for those of you from elsewhere. I'm Bob Citron, the vaccine guy from WCBP, getting my greatest thrill now with having vaccine suddenly be in everyone's mind. First of all, this has been a fantastic meeting the last 2 weeks, and I want to thank Julia and Chris and Cassandra for putting together such a wonderful program, and Karen for figuring out how to make it all happen. I am pleased today to welcome our second keynote presentation for the closing session today, and that is Peter Hotez, who is Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor and Texas Children's Hospital Chair of Tropical Medicine. He has been working on a variety of vaccine projects over the last few years, including hookworm and schistosomiasis, Chagas disease, SARS, MERS, and SARS-2. And I think the important take-home message is that there has been a lot of early work going on over many, many years on these vaccines that prepare us for this particular time. And I thought it would be really good to bring Peter on because of his definite outlook on these products. And just to give you a little background, Peter has an undergraduate degree in molecular biophysics from Yale University and a PhD in biochemistry and then a medical degree from Cornell. So he has a unique, broad perspective in working with him on a bunch of vaccine programs. And he asked me questions that I can't answer. So that makes me feel really good. And of course, many of you will know him from his time on a variety of TV stations, most lately CNN and the like, where his commentary and thoughts on vaccines are on being widely observed. And clearly the classical view with him and his bow tie, as I'm sure everyone notices. So I am very pleased to welcome Peter. And afterwards, we'll be accepting questions for you to answer. So please send them in during the course of the talk, and we will ask him afterwards. So thank you, everyone. And here is Peter.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that very generous introduction, and excited to be here. And I think what I'll do is, rather than use the usual format and speak for a full hour or even 50 minutes, try to speak for a little bit less, because in this time of COVID, it's not that people are necessarily clamoring for more PowerPoint slides, and try to leave a fair bit of time for Q&A as well. And this talk will be probably a little different from some of the others that you've heard, in that it's kind of a 30,000-foot aerial view of where I see the world heading in terms of disease and vaccines especially, and also focusing a fair bit on my real concerns about this terrible anti-science movement that I think is getting out of hand, and maybe we can even have some discussion about how to address that. And I think one of the messages is going to be for this morning, my time, is the fact that a lot of the forces that are bringing back disease and interfering with our work are not necessarily coming from the biomedical model. They're social forces such as poverty and political collapse and some climate change and this rise in anti-science. And these are not the kinds of things that those of us in the biomedical sciences get training about. And maybe this is a time to rethink about how we're doing graduate and postdoctoral education, or maybe not. So let's begin. I'm going to start here with going back 20 years. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since the Gavi Alliance was announced through this partnership with the UN agencies, including WHO and UNICEF and the World Bank, and of course the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This was the first big tranche of money that the Gates family gave, $750 million back in 2000. And it was in partnership with the Millennium Development Goals, which had that very important teddy bear number 4 in the middle there to reduce child mortality, and that was one of the driving stimuli for all of this. And I think my first, and on the left there is an amazing picture when all UN leaders were brought to global headquarters in New York, and that's Kofi Annan in front, and Bill Clinton's there, and just I think George W. Bush is there. It's really quite an extraordinary gathering of individuals. And I think the point is, people tend to scoff at these big global initiatives, but this is one of them that I think has really worked, because at the same time Gates helped stimulate the Gavi Alliance. They also stimulated the formation of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington in Seattle to actually measure whether any of this stuff actually works. And clearly it does. This is the latest enumeration, just came out a couple of weeks ago from the Institute for Health Metrics in terms of impact. I mean, this is the under 5 childhood deaths through the Global Burden of Disease Study 2019. And you can see that we've seen over the last 20 years, or 19 years anyway, pretty dramatic declines in number of kids dying from measles and pertussis and tetanus and diphtheria and meningitis. And I know many of the people who are listening were involved in this, and congratulations to all your great work. If you ever need a little pat on the back, take a look at the right-hand column there. I wrote Sebastião Salgado, who's a Brazilian artist and photographer who spent time going all around the world watching kids getting their vaccines and photographing in black and white images. I first saw this in an event at PAHO a few years back, and they're a very moving set of images. A lot of it is around polio vaccinations, but not exclusively, and just the expression on the parents' faces, and you see the full range of human emotions there. And it's a very moving set of pictures that I like to look at when in these terrible times when you need a little bit of inspiration. Now, I have a new book coming out. In fact, it comes out this month. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science. It's published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And I actually started writing it about a year before COVID-19, so in 2019. And it makes the point that while we have seen enormous progress, my premise is in certain pockets of the world, even as early as 2019, we started to see sort of fraying or declines in our ability to do this, to vaccinate the world's children. And when I looked, and a lot of it was written about my time as U.S. Science Envoy for the State Department in the White House under Obama, when I was asked to help build relations in vaccine development between the United States government and research institutions in the U.S. With Muslim majority countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And that was a very important time. It was a scary time because it was right after the ISIS occupation in Syria and Iraq. And when I looked at it, when I saw the forces that are bringing back illness, they were not the kinds of things that we ordinarily think about as biomedical sciences and scientists. And the list is on the left there: poverty, war, political instability. Oops, I got poverty again there. Urbanization, deforestation, climate change, and this rise in anti-science. And it occurred to me that these were the things that were really causing us some of the greatest headaches. And so there's a lot of awareness now about climate change. And one of the things that I have been looking at is, yes, climate change is important, but it's not climate change in isolation. Climate change seems to work, in my opinion, through all of these social drivers. And so when I look to see where the new hot zones for vaccine preventable and neglected tropical diseases, they're the circles in blue. And again, it's where political instability is combining with climate change, urbanization, and anti-science forces. So an example is the Arabian Peninsula, where in the ISIS-occupied areas in Syria and Iraq, and then in Yemen, where the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia was unfolding. That's where we saw collapses in health systems and returns of cholera and vaccine-preventable diseases, as well as leishmaniasis. And the other piece to this was the unprecedented temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius that was drying up ancient agricultural lands along the Tigris and Euphrates, and people abandoning them and moving into places like Aleppo. So it wasn't only political instability, it was this really interesting combination of climate change with the social and economic and political forces on the Arabian Peninsula. And same in what I called Africa's unwars, which is a term not from me, from Jeffrey Gettleman of the New York Times, who wrote about the fact that the wars we're seeing in Africa increasingly are not wars as we know them between warring factions, but in fact predation of armed militias on citizens. And a good example of that is what's happening in Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, which is really thwarting a lot of efforts at polio control and eradication, as well as the elimination of sleeping sickness and other illnesses. And we see it in Central Latin America, not only in Venezuela with the Maduro regime, which has, Venezuela for decades was at the forefront of disease control in Latin America. Now it's at the bottom, and we're seeing obviously return of measles and Chagas disease, and now the measles is extending across the border into Roraima and Amazonas state in Brazil and into Colombia. So this is destabilizing South America and the Western Hemisphere. And I've got Texas and the Gulf Coast there, not so much of political instability, but you are seeing these unique forces. So Texas and the Gulf Coast are probably the areas most vulnerable to climate change and urbanization and this rise in anti-science. And it's one of the reasons why we have our school in tropical medicine in the state of Texas. So there's going to be this urgent need to begin addressing illness, not only in terms of developing vaccines, but all of the surrounding forces accompanying it. And when we look at what's happening with COVID-19, that's its own interesting set of forces. 100 million cases, 2 million deaths. And one of the observations that we've made is that this illness right now, anyway, at least until the variants maybe hit Africa, is the fact that this is overwhelmingly an illness of the G20 nations, the 20 wealthiest economies. But it's the poor living among the wealthy that are most effective. So it's those in low-income neighborhoods in the United States and in Brazil and elsewhere. And last night on MSNBC with Chris Hayes, we spoke a lot about how low-income neighborhoods across the U.S., especially in African-American neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods, are really being decimated by this illness, what I'm calling historic decimation. And this is not new. A few years back, when I've been talking about the impact of poverty-related diseases, I came up with this curious observation that when you use either health metrics data or WHO data, it's not necessarily predominantly in the poorest, most devastated countries of Africa or Asia, but rather it's the poor living among the wealthy that now account for a huge amount of poverty-related neglected diseases. And so when you look at where the world's worm infections are, or leishmaniasis, or Chagas disease, or dengue, or tuberculosis, the list goes on, overwhelmingly, or leprosy, it's overwhelmingly the poor in the G20 nations. So the other shift is the fact that it's, when we talk about global health, the paradigm is developed versus developing countries, poor versus wealthy countries, global north versus global south. And now I'm saying not quite. It's, yeah, there's still those pieces there, but more and more it's the poor living among the wealthy, and I've given it this new name of blue marble health. And that this thing on the right over there, poverty and the impact of COVID-19, Johns Hopkins Press has updated an older book that I've written on this to make it relevant to COVID-19. You could download it free of charge on Johns Hopkins Project Muse. And now with COVID-19, the other unraveling that I'm worried about is the fact that we are starting to see, because of the disruption of COVID-19 declines in childhood vaccination. So those trends that were starting since 2015 are being exacerbated by COVID-19. And we're seeing, for instance, these are big declines just in the US with our ability to vaccinate kids against measles, coming back up a little bit, but the World Health Organization is increasingly reporting return of measles in this time of COVID-19. So this is a very fragile moment in our time of global health over the last 20 years, when everything could unravel unless we are very careful about how we do our global health governance. And one of the advantages now of having the Biden administration up is the U.S. has rejoined the World Health Organization. I assume we're going to rejoin COVAX or join COVAX, and that potentially is important news. It's not going to solve everything by a long shot, but I am impressed by for years I took the role of U.S. leadership in global health governance for granted, never really thinking that much about it until it was taken away. And then I realized that was a loss, and now restoring that, I think, is going to be very important. We have lots of COVID-19 vaccines in play. This is a slide from Tony Fauci earlier this year. And, I'm often asked about, hey, which vaccine are you waiting for or going to take? And I've always said, look, they all work the same way. They all work by inducing strong immune responses to the spike protein of the virus. And they're likely all going to be successful. And I also make the point that, when people say these vaccines were rushed and not adequately tested for safety, I say, hold on, this builds on really 15 years or more of research and development by scientists in the U.S. and Europe, in Asia, across the globe, spending a lot of time showing the importance of inducing immunity to the spike protein, how to deliver the spike protein in ways that induce high levels of virus neutralizing antibody and T cell responses. So it's not, it's this idea that somehow COVID-19 vaccines magically appeared is not quite right. It does build on research and development for the last 2 decades. And that's important because it gives people reassurance that there's not something weird about the vaccine development program for COVID-19. Yes, there are some extraordinary things that happen, but it still builds on decades of research, just like all of our other vaccines have. And the performance features we want, of course, is they're doing the most important things on the left, preventing us from going to the hospital or the intensive care unit and preventing us from dying or our family members from dying. I've recently gotten my 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and very grateful for that. But now I think we're now looking at the next step. And is there a hope that if we can achieve high enough vaccine coverage, will we stop asymptomatic infection and virus shedding? And I think the answer is going to be yes. We don't know that for certain yet, but I do have some optimism that these vaccines are going to be more than anti-disease vaccines. They're going to be instrumental in helping us climb our way out of the pandemic. It also means that some other things going to happen, which includes vaccinating adolescents and children. And at the bottom, too, I'm going to go in a little more detail in a bit about how we're going to also have to step up our public communications around vaccinations and halt this very aggressive anti-vaccine movement. And so, again, which one, Doc? I'm asked that all the time, and I say, look, whatever one you can get. I'm equally enthusiastic for Pfizer and Moderna and Novavax and AstraZeneca, Oxford and J&J and our vaccine and many of the others, because they're all working by inducing virus neutralizing antibody. We don't know what the durability of protection is, and we're not going to know that for a while. And I say, look, don't worry about it. Potentially we'll need a third immunization as a boost. And of course, with the variants, that boost may be with a modified vaccine. But this is not a time to try to cherry pick which vaccination that you're going to get what you can. And now, of course, we have the new variants. And when they first emerged, I wasn't that worried, but now I'm really worried as I'm seeing how this is taken over in places like England and South Africa. And then now this is really starting to accelerate in the United States. And one of the big problems that we've had in the US is we've profoundly underachieved in terms of virus genomic sequencing. And that's extremely disappointing. By some accounts, we've sequenced less than 100,000 virus genomes when we really should be in the millions or tens of millions in order to fully understand the spectrum of these variants. And I'm quite convinced that when we start doing that, we're going to see homegrown variants that resemble some in the UK and South Africa. I think one of the unknowns is, will all of these variants more or less look the same in terms of the 501 and 484 mutations? or are we looking at something completely different? And it's really interesting that there does seem to be that selective pressure to produce variants of concern that affect those particular 2 or 3 amino acids in the receptor binding domain of the SARS coronavirus type 2. But no question about it, this is going to be now our new challenge. And this is what's so tough about this. It's this unrelenting nature about COVID-19. We're all kind of exhausted after last year, and now we've got to pick ourselves up once again, and now deal with what in many respects may be a new epidemic because of these variants. And I'm particularly worried about what happens in Africa. So the drug manufacturers have been fantastic at really responding to these global wrenching shifts. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm amazed when I look at Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, Novavax, J&J, and AstraZeneca, Oxford. Everyone's responded very quickly to get an idea of what's happening with the ZA is the abbreviation for South Africa, how they've been able to change so quickly. And it is, I think, a testament of how when the pharma companies can work with governments and UN agencies, we can get so much done when we have to. And the fact that we are still seeing high levels of protection makes me feel good. I mean, one of the interesting features that I've noticed about the ones that I think will be good enough for now against the South African variant is they all start with really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody, and then that acts as a buffer with the new variants, because even if there's a reduction, it's still good enough. I do worry, though, for instance, about the Chinese Sinovac vaccine and the Russian Gamaleya vaccine, that even though it had good levels of protection, the levels of virus neutralizing antibody are quite modest, and I'm not certain that there's enough buffer there unless the other immune responses are equally as important for them to be effective against the South African variant. So now many of us are in this difficult situation, and I'm sure we're all on Zoom calls pretty regularly, looking at the options on the right. Do we develop new bivalent vaccines, or do we proceed as planned and then design ones for the South African variant with a boost? And I think probably option 2 is probably going to be the more common feature. And that is going to require a lot of communication with the public. And there's going to be a lot of complexities around regulatory authorities and global governance around how we do that, and how we do that as expeditiously as possible. And I know many of you are on calls about that. And of course, I'm particularly worried about what's happening now globally with these variants as they'll start to race through our big urban areas. Right now, for the first time in the last few years, the planet has more people living in cities than they do in rural areas. That shift has happened, and it's going to be an increasing trend over the next few decades as we become a series of megacities, especially places in Congo, like Kinshasa or Lagos in Nigeria, or Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and of course the big Indian megacities. This is going to be the new challenge of how we can develop vaccines for this the shifting pattern of massive numbers of people, and in places where I can't even imagine how you would do social distancing. And I'm a bit worried because when you look at the landscape of vaccines that are going to be available for this situation, we're seeing a lot of, as more and more drop out, we're left with fewer and fewer options for global health. We've got the AstraZeneca vaccine, the J&J vaccine, and then through the Serum Institute of India, Bharat, and Biological E, we've got some other additional vaccines like our recombinant protein vaccine with BioE, or the inactivated virus. But I'm a bit worried about our options that we're going to have to really fight this pandemic in the low and middle income countries. So I think the COVAX sharing facility was brilliant in its conception. It's getting better finance. It's still underfinanced, but how we're going to deal with this next phase, I think, is going to be the one of the great challenges of our time. In terms of what we're doing, we've been working on coronavirus vaccines for the last decade, and now we have this collaboration with PATH based in Seattle that led the development of the meningococcal vaccine for Africa, the malaria vaccine for Africa, as well as with Biological E in Hyderabad and India, and then Dynavax for the CPG adjuvant to develop a recombinant protein vaccine on alum together with CPG as one of those low-cost options for low and middle income countries. And this is part of a larger program that we have at Texas Children's to develop, as Bob mentioned, our various parasitic disease vaccines. And this is what I've been working on most of my professional life since I was an MD PhD student in the 80s, trying to look at very complicated eukaryotic targets like leishmania and trypanosomes and hookworms and schistosomes. And this is now in the last 20 years in partnership with Mary Elena Potazzi, my science partner for the last 20 years. But you know, we haven't really talked about it before, but around 10 years ago, we started partnering with a group at the New York Blood Center and the Galveston National Lab because for similar reason, coronavirus vaccines had been orphaned, and we began developing SARS-MERS and then SARS-2 vaccines. And this was a strategy that was developed by Lan Du and Shibu Jiang at the New York Blood Center, and the introduction came while we were working on a vaccine for onchocerciasis. She introduced us to this and was able to show that the spike protein, this trimeric spike protein, is very immunogenic, but it induces lots of eosinophilic immune enhancement. And the receptor binding domain of this turned out to induce high levels of virus neutralizing antibody, but without the eosinophilic immune enhancement that accompanied the spike protein or the inactivated virus. So that was very promising for us, and we began shaping those vaccines for SARS and then MERS. And we did everything in Pichia pastoris because we wanted a low-cost approach. This is an approach that's been used to develop the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine in Bangladesh, in Brazil, in Cuba, and India, and Indonesia, as either Pichia or its related yeast, Hensenula. And now we've been able to target that specifically for COVID-19. We began with the SARS vaccine that was produced at Walter Reed, SARS-1, and then when the Chinese put up the new sequence in bioRxiv in January, we were able to pivot around and develop that very, very quickly. And you know, the kinds of things that that helped us hit the ground running is we had made modifications for SARS-1, including expressing the protein without an N-terminal asparagine that was heavily glycosylated, and that helped with some of the heavy glycosylation that would interfere with production and immunogenicity, as well as free cysteine that allowed intermolecular disulfide bonds. So it took us years to work all of this out, but again, this is why we were able to hit the ground running when we got to the SARS-2 sequence. So this is being done now with Biological E. We're scaling up production, clinical testing in 5 sites in India. And again, it's the receptor binding domain of the SARS-2 spike protein produced in Pichia pastoris yeast on alum with CPG for Dynavax. And we developed the production cell banks, research cell banks at Baylor. And now it's been licensed to Biological E in a non-exclusive agreement, but now we're in discussions with Indonesia and Israel and Panama and multiple countries about replicating that. And it's pretty exciting because it's producing really high levels of virus neutralizing antibody in mice and non-human primates, really high levels of protection that we're enthusiastic about. And we're doing this for about $1.50 a dose, so about as inexpensive as you can get. And the other thing about it is it builds on a 40-year track record of safety for the hepatitis B vaccine. And the hepatitis B vaccine, you know, as everyone knows, has been widely used and is extremely inexpensive, made locally. So if we can offer something similar, it might not only be useful for adults, but also kids as well. And this is our collaboration in the non-human primate model, which we have a paper under review in collaboration with Emory University to show the evidence of really strong protection, and we're quite excited by that as well. Now, as that's going on, we have to deal with this abrupt rise in anti-science forces, and many of us who think about vaccine development are not thinking on a regular basis about these aggressive anti-vaccine determinants. But I think this is something we're finally going to have to deal with. And I've been going up against this for many, many years, especially after I wrote this book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, because I'm not only a vaccine scientist, but I have my youngest daughter, Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities, and wrote this book to go into detail explaining why vaccines don't cause autism, and also what autism is and how it begins in early fetal brain development. And of course, this put me at odds with some aggressive and well-funded anti-vaccine groups. And it's given me a lot of insight into what's actually happening. And I thought I would just share it, and that was the stimulus for the next book on the left. But I want to share with you some of the things that I think are going on, because we haven't really taken on anti-science groups, anti-vaccine groups in a big way. And I just want to leave with you on a sort of a sobering note about what we need to start thinking about doing to counteract it. So this concept of vaccine hesitancy in its modern form really began 23 years ago with publication by Andrew Wakefield and his colleagues of a paper that was ultimately retracted by the Lancet. The paper, and 12 years later, it was a paper claiming that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, has the ability to replicate in the colon, the intestine, and then causes what they then called pervasive developmental disorder, what we now call autism, and ultimately took an investigation by Brian Deere, who was an investigative journalist for the Sunday Times of London, who wrote a series of articles for the Sunday Times and then for the British Medical Journal that uncovered a pretty elaborate fraud and payola scheme by this group that led to the retraction, but it caused a lot of damage in the 12 years that it took to become retracted. And this is what led then to the rise of measles. And measles tends to be the first to erupt because it has the highest reproductive number. So you start seeing declines in vaccination with that high reproductive number. That's often the first to appear. And then it got to the point where we saw 80,000 measles cases in 2018, 90,000 measles cases in 2019. And this led the World Health Organization a year before COVID to declare vaccine hesitancy one of the top 10 global health threats for us. And this certainly began taking off in the United States as well. And now it's gotten to a point where we're very concerned about its impact on COVID-19 vaccinations. And we have just published a study in Social Science and Medicine. I'm not a social scientist, but we collaborated with a group of social scientists at Texas A&M led by Tim Callahan. And we did a survey of which groups are most likely to be vaccine hesitant, and they're substantial. And what was interesting about it was, even though we used two different methodologies, the Kaiser Family Foundation more or less came to the same conclusion. So they're among their most vaccine hesitant groups were what they called Republicans and the African American population. And we saw the same thing, Trump voters, African American population. So it's kind of interesting, two different methods, two different groups, and talk about diametrically opposed, meeting in the middle around vaccine hesitancy. So I thought spend a minute kind of explaining the evolution of this. How did we get to Republicans, or Trump voters as they're called, and African Americans as two of the most vaccine hesitant groups? And I have a few ideas around that. First of all, let's look at the shape of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States. That began after the Wakefield paper. You started to see first or it was around autism, claiming that it was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And then Bobby Kennedy came along and said, no, I don't mean the MMR vaccine. That once we debunked that, and we were able to show that that it's not the MMR vaccine, it's the thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccines, and and then it shifted again to around spacing, and then it was alum. And so this caused an enormous amount of disruption. And each time the scientific community had to respond and show that it wasn't that. And we spent an enormous amount of effort debunking each one. And then it shifted again to this concept of medical freedom. So as we began debunking the links between MMR thimerosal and autism, it then shifted to what we call health freedom. And by health freedom, I'm going to explain that in a minute, and now it's shifting again. So we're constantly dealing with these revision of important forces. So let's start out talking about vaccines and autism. So this began over here where I'd written this book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, and this is me with Rachel over here, and showing that there is no link, but also going into what autism is and how we have more than 100 genes involved in early fetal brain development, which included our doing whole exome sequencing on Rachel and my wife and I. And this was really tough because the anti-vaccine groups saw this as a major threat. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy began labeling me as the OG villain, the original gangster villain. So you're listening to the original gangster villain today. And now the evidence is over. We've been able to provide an overwhelming amount of evidence delinking those two things. And here we have more than 100 genes involved in autism spectrum disorder. This is an enormous study done by the Broad Institute at Harvard MIT that identified genes involved in early expression in the neocortex of the brain. Most are expressed or enriched in excitatory and inhibitory neuronal lineages, and they affect synapses and other genes. And a lot of them are involved in the neuronal cytoskeleton. And with Rachel, we were able to show it was due to non-red cell spectrin, a neuronal spectrin. So that we have a great explanation for what the basis of autism is and how it leads to patches of disorganization in the neocortex of children with autism. And then this caused a number of people in California and the United States to stop vaccinating their kids. But as that started to happen, and as measles outbreaks started to occur, the California legislature closed those loopholes, allowing non-medical exemptions. And this led to a new wave of reasons for not vaccinating. And it was under this banner of health freedom or medical freedom. And it really began in Orange County, California, with the Disneyland measles outbreak in 2014, 2015. And then it moved to Texas, where it had a huge amplifying effect. And the amplifying effect was now we have 72,000 kids being denied access to their vaccinations in the state of Texas. And a lot of it is based in the Austin area and the North Texas area, where you have specifically designated anti-vaccine groups, including Texans for Vaccine Choice. And this doesn't account for any of the homeschooled kids in the state of Texas. We have 350,000 homeschooled kids in the state of Texas. So we've seen this new kind of banner of health freedom. And the key that happened here and really strengthened it was it started to receive a lot of funding from political extremism on the political right. We got a lot of funding from the Tea Party in Texas and other far right-wing donor groups that really amplified it and gave it a lot of power. They created political action committees like Texans for Vaccine Choice, Oklahomans for Vaccine Choice. And this thing was starting to steamroll. And then you had people like Robert F. Kennedy enlarge this in 2018 to create one of the best funded, well-organized anti-vaccine organizations called Children's Health Defense. And this concept of health freedom really started to take hold across the country. It first started out in Texas. But then in 2020, what we saw with COVID-19 is what was an anti-vaccine movement then became a full-on anti-science movement that glommed on protests against social distancing, contact tracing, and masks. And I think this is one of the things that really helped amplify the COVID-19 epidemic, and one of the reasons why we've lost 450,000 American lives, not only because of COVID-19, but tying political allegiance to this far right-wing movement really proved to be extremely deadly. The other thing that's happening then, and that kind of explains a lot of this link to the far political right, the other thing that has happened with respect to the African-American community, that also is quite interesting. So the anti-vaccine groups, starting in 2017, began targeting specific ethnic groups, including the Somali immigrant community in Minnesota, that drove down vaccination rates to cause terrible measles epidemics among this group. And then they shifted to 2018 to Orthodox Jewish groups in New York and New Jersey. They started hosting town hall rallies and doing really inflammatory things like parading around with fake yellow Jewish stars with the word vax written in it, and the word vax was made to look like Hebrew letters. And then in 2019, they pivoted again to the African-American community, started hosting these Harlem vaccine forums to convince the African-American community that vaccines are dangerous. And so when we talk about the vaccine hesitancy in the African-American community, so much about it is around structural racism, historic racism, and the terrible legacy of Tuskegee. And of course, I get that. But the other piece that I like to inform people about is the fact that there has been this deliberate targeting. And so now we're left once again to knock down the whack-a-mole in terms of explaining why these vaccines were not rushed and that they were tested for safety and dealing with the conflicts of interest. And then all of these assertions that mRNA vaccines cause infertility and autoimmunity and genetically modified humans, trying to explain what cell biology is and why a cell has a nucleus and cytoplasm, why mRNA is not going into the nucleus, and crazy things about 5G and thalidomide and allergic reactions and sudden deaths. So this has become a new part-time job for me, kind of debunking this. And then to end, what was in the U.S. is now expanded across into Western Europe. And in Western Europe now we're starting to we're seeing that same piece of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States shift over to European capitals. So over the summer, some of the same leaders of the anti-vaccine movement in the U.S. began speaking at what were anti-mask, anti-vaccine rallies in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and there are reports from the BBC and New York Times and elsewhere that these were linked to QAnon and far political extremism on the right. And so once again, we're seeing this export to Western Europe as a full-on anti-science movement. And to make things even more complicated is we've got now state actors involved. We have the Russian government. This came out of U.S. and British intelligence, is launching programs of weaponized health communications against vaccines. So I have a new paper that came out last week called Anti-Science Kills, which kind of goes through the history of this. And there's a lot of irony here because, the Russians are aghast that the world is not so accepting of the Gamaleya adenovirus vaccine, and yet they are one of the greatest offenders and the only major state actor that has created this whole anti-vaccine environment. So that's what's ahead of us. I'll end here by saying, I think we're in a bit of an epic struggle that we're making great progress developing vaccines. But how we're going to deal with these 21st century forces that I've begun to outline here, I think is going to be one of the great challenges for the next few years. So, Bob, let me stop there and see what people are thinking and get their thoughts on all of this.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was a fantastic overview of science and anti-science, I guess. And this meeting, of course, has been many, many years focusing on science and the success of biotech. And I think all of us have kind of taken that for granted. There has always been an anti-vaccine movement, and it's interesting to see how it's broadening a lot to the total anti-science movement. And most of the questions coming in are about that.
Bob, before we get to the question, let me just amplify that comment. I think what's happened is, we always treated this as kind of a fringe group. We never took it very seriously. And I have had this fight with the HHS agencies for a long time. The message was, well, if you talk about it, you'll give it oxygen. And I've been saying for years, hey, that horse has left the barn, that train has left the station. And now we've enabled it by just pretending it's a fringe movement. Sorry, but go ahead with
no
questions.
No, I mean that's the it's kind of, and I think with the modern communications and these things have expanded certainly in the political environment, so it's certainly been very extensive. So I'm looking at the various questions. Certainly the how do we establish trust in science, especially among groups that have been exploited in the past, like the Tuskegee syphilis study? And that's one question, but there'll be others as well.
So with that one, well, first of all, I think Operation Warp Speed was a good program from a development point of view. We've been hearing the fact that it didn't have the plans for getting vaccines in the arms of people. But the other thing it didn't have was really a communication strategy. I think the idea was leave the communication to the pharma CEOs, and that met with varying degrees of success. Some of the pharma CEOs are better communicators than others. And so there was a vacuum that was filled by the anti-vaccine groups. And this is one of the reasons I've been out there so often explaining vaccinations and vaccines. And now what I'm doing is I'm trying to get as many Americans vaccinated as I can. So I'm targeting those two groups. So for instance, with the Trump voters, I'm going on all these conservative news outlets like Newsmax and Fox News. And that's really interesting because one of the things that comes up a lot is this obsession with vaccine mandates. There is this belief that the military is going to come in and force everybody to get vaccinated. And I have to explain as a straightforward way as I can. Look, the vaccines aren't here to do that. It's not going to happen. And nobody is really talking about vaccine mandates at this point. And then with the African American community, one of the things I'm trying to highlight is the high death rate among younger groups. So for instance, the narrative out there is that this is overwhelmingly a disease of people over the age of 65, but among African American and Hispanic and Native American groups, 30 or 35% of the deaths are under the age of 65. So we're losing a generation of moms and dads and brothers and sisters in the Black and brown communities across the country. And that seems to resonate sometimes. But so is going on as many programs as I can on radio and podcasts to kind of reach these groups. But it's tough. It's really tough.
I think it certainly must be exciting to be broadening your news outlets, and we're thrilled to have you here. Trust me, this is a friendly audience. We've been deep in biotech for 25 years. But question, is there an understanding why the G20 appear to have higher infectious rates? Is that just because we have better data, or is that real? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Is it because, if you don't look, you don't find it, right? So that could be a component of it. They have the systems in place to be able to monitor it. Clearly some of the largest cities are still in G20 countries. But again, it's the low-income neighborhoods that are really getting especially hammered in many of these countries. And this is a story that we really haven't told well enough in the United States. Again, the devastation among, what we see here in South Texas, among Hispanic communities, African American communities, really getting hammered. The Indian reservations are getting hit very hard, and I suspect a lot of that's what's going on in Brazil as well, in the Latin American countries.
And again, building on that with social media, I'll read this question verbatim. Social media fuels the dis and misinformation of vaccines to a non-scientific community, many of whom feel marginalized by classism and lack of education. What research has been done in countering these messages, and how do manufacturers do this effectively? I think you started to build on that. Maybe expand a little more on that.
Yeah, so I think one is, amplifying the message, and I've been on Zoom calls all 2020 and now into 2021 about how do we shape our message, fine tune our message. And I think those are productive discussions, but then I kind of take a lot of wind out of everyone's sails. But I say, look, it's great we're doing this, and I think the public service announcements are great, and I think the program of systematized communication is important, and that'll get us about 30 to 40% of the way there, because it's still drowned out by the anti-vaccine message. I mean, the anti-vaccine people dominate the internet. For instance, if you go to Amazon.com, and if you go put books up at the top, as everyone has done, press return, you'll get a scroll down menu on the left that says health, fitness, and dieting. You can do this as I'm talking. You click on that again to books on vaccinations. It's all fake anti-vaccine books and COVID conspiracy books. So Amazon is the single largest promoter of vaccine disinformation. And again, despite everything I'm hearing from the social media companies, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, all the stuff they're doing, when I go to my 10 sites that go after me the most, the 10 leading anti-vaccine groups, they're all operating as though there's no change. So there's been really no good faith effort to take down the anti-vaccine content. And I'm a proponent that that's what we have to do. There's more than 480 fake anti-vaccine websites, again, all revved up on social media. You can't do much about the websites, but there's no reason why we have to allow these groups propagate on social media. And then, of course, the anti-vaccine groups accuse me of book burning and interference with First Amendment rights. And I point out, look, these are private organizations. They have no obligation to support this stuff. And I really think it's important to take down, at least for a while, until we can get our arms around vaccinating people with COVID-19. And it's not as if they're going to go away entirely. They still have their websites, and they'll come back up under different names, but at least it'll disable them for a while, almost like using military metaphors here to at least take them down on a short-term basis, because otherwise we're just not going to get our arms around this. They just dominate the internet. And so what does that mean? So I've been an advocate for the Biden administration to create an interagency task force, which, of course, has the Health and Human Services agencies, but also brings in Homeland Security, brings in Commerce, brings in the Justice Department, because I think there's a lot of fraud around, selling fake autism cures and nutritional supplements. I mean, these guys are monetizing the internet in a huge way. But also even State Department, because at some point we've got to deal with Russia as a state actor that is just drowning our social media with bots and trolls and this systematized program of weaponized health communication, and no one is doing anything about that. And this also has to happen at the UN agency level. And so far, and this is where everybody walks away from me. So everybody likes me on the Zoom calls to help them with the messaging and that kind of stuff. But the minute I suggest, taking down the anti-vaccine content, that makes people very uncomfortable, especially in academia. It's not something we're supposed to talk about. And so there I tend to be an outlier, for full disclosure, but I don't see a way around it. I mean, look at what's happening now. We've got these horrible class action lawsuits against Merck and company for the HPV vaccine. led by Children's Health Defense and Robert F. Kennedy. Claiming that's causing infertility or autoimmunity, it's all nonsense, right? I mean, it's all kind of made up, and yet it's very powerful, and I think we've got to do something about it.
And interesting observation. I'm a senior citizen. My wife and I have been spending the last weeks, I'm in Pennsylvania, trying to find the vaccine anywhere we can. And then I look on the news media and I see the physicians and people in the health community are not taking the vaccine that they're being offered. And do you have any sense of even the uptake amongst your peer group, and why they're not doing it? And that for me is certainly frustrating.
Well, it's beyond frustrating. It's right. It's absolutely maddening. I mean, here at least people are calling Duane Reade and Rite Aid and CVS and pharmacies desperate to get their mother, their father, their spouses, or the brother or sisters vaccinated. And then there's this. So I know it's absolutely terrible. I think we have to streamline the guidelines first of all, and we've got to figure out a way to make people understand why these vaccines are going to save lives. And it is physicians, but I think it's mostly some of the non-physician healthcare providers. And what we're not getting is a full disclosure, transparency of who's not getting vaccinated. So I think, we're hearing reports that 20, 30, 40% of healthcare providers who are offered the vaccine in 1A are turning it down. We need to understand who that is so we can, really work with them to get them vaccinated. And the sooner that happens, the better. But it is absolutely astonishing.
This is an interesting one because I think the attendees at this meeting are all scientists who have been working in science and a lot in therapeutic areas, and certainly biologics that have caused recovery from cancer or whatever. So everyone in this conference, I think, has a good sense of success in life. But basically, this anti-science movement is certainly troubling. What are your thoughts on the roles of schools and universities in teaching people critical thinking and making them less susceptible to these conspiracy theories and anti-science?
Yeah, it's absolutely important. But the other piece to this, and I've written a paper about this last year, is I think, we need to hear from scientists more, meaning that too much of our message is filtered through the journalists and the anchors and third parties rather than hearing directly from scientists. And I think one of the things that I've learned, being on CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News every day for a year, is people like hearing from scientists. They don't necessarily mind the complexity even. I think when I look at why, for instance, the White House Coronavirus Task Force did such a bad job in 2020 in communicating, is somebody told them that they have to talk to the American people like they're in the 4th grade or the 6th grade. And in fact, that was very off-putting because it simplified things to the point where it actually turned out not to be true. And when people had the chance to hear from the scientists directly, I think more often than not, they liked what they heard. And that stimulated me to think about maybe we should be building in science communication into our PhD training, our postdoctoral training, our medical training, our residency training, because we don't really know how to do that. I mean, I had to learn through trial and error, probably more error than trial. And there are good ways to do this. So building in programs of communication and engagement, I think, is one way to go. I think the other is we have to figure out a way to foster or welcome scientists talking out and talking to the public. I, like everybody else, I get an annual evaluation, and in my case, being an academic, what am I asked about on my annual evaluation forms? It's my grants and my papers and my grants and my papers and my grants and my papers, right? There's nothing there about even the books I've written, the single author books, or, the op-ed pieces I've written or my commentary pieces, and certainly nothing about, being on TV or radio or in newspaper interviews, and definitely nothing about social media, right? Or Twitter followers and things like that. So, the message that the academic health centers are sending is, not only is it barely tolerated, it's overall not welcomed, right? The science and health communications of academic health centers are all about protecting the institution. They're very risk averse. They don't want to be out there too much in the media. And they don't particularly like their scientists and docs speaking out. And so it's not only is it not encouraged, it's in some ways it's actually discouraged. And I think we have to now recognize that this is an important activity and find a way to slowly change the ecosystem to make it more welcoming to speak out. I mean, for instance, when I was going out there in MSNBC and MSNBC, the message from the bosses was just stick to the science, don't get into the political realm. And then, starting in the spring, it was bad enough that we weren't leading a federal response, leaving it to the states. But then came the disinformation campaign. Scott Atlas came a little later, but then there was the outright disinformation campaign of downplaying the severity of the epidemic and saying the COVID deaths were due to other causes, or that the hospital admissions were due to catch up in elective surgeries from the lockdowns. And the list went on, spectacularizing hydroxychloroquine, and the list went on. And all of a sudden I looked at this and said, wait a minute, I've seen this before. This was the tactics that the anti-vaxxers were using. This is what an anti-science disinformation campaign looks like. And because I'd been, up against these groups for years, I was one of the first to call it out and call it that, a deliberate anti-science disinformation campaign. And then when people heard me say that, they looked and said, yeah, that is right. That's what it is. And that's, was very valuable. But, to disentangle the anti-science from the politics, I had to go into the politics. And that was a very uncomfortable place, because it meant you had to go into a pretty dark area. And I got heavily criticized because many interpreted that as I was trying to defeat Trump, or, trying to support the Democrats. And no, it wasn't the case. It was simply I had to say whatever I needed to do to save lives. And that meant calling out the disinformation campaign. And now the other flip side of this is there are some things that the Biden administration is not doing in terms of accelerating vaccinations ahead of the variants. I think they should be doing. And now that I'm not even being critical of the Biden administration, I'm just, making statements on things I would do differently. That's now being interpreted as a betrayal. So I can't win for losing. But, I'm hoping that just by, saying that I'm doing whatever it takes to save lives, I'll come out in the end okay.
Well, I want to thank you for this very stimulating presentation and your time on TV speaking for science and speaking for vaccines. I've spent my career on this, and to see people talking about multi-dose vials and dating and temperature and out of temperature stuff, which we deal with every day, is exciting to see this in the commonplace. And I think you've done a fantastic job here presenting to us, but more importantly, putting on that image of science to the world. And I think it's something we need to take home more, even from the scientists here, that we're not in our own community anymore. We have a public persona that we have to build on. So I want to thank you very much for being here and presenting to us and being part of our image to the world. We appreciate that very much. And unfortunately, you're not going to hear any applause because maybe the electrons will vibrate a bit, but thank you so much. And we appreciate
I feel them
it.
vibrating. I feel them vibrating, Bob. So thank you so much. And it's a real honor to present to everyone. And feel free to follow up with me. My email is pretty accessible. It's just Hotez, last name, at BCM. It stands for Baylor College of Medicine.edu, Hotez at BCM.edu. The anti-vaxxers have no problems reaching me, and so I'm happy to always hear from you, get your thoughts. I'm not as fast on the email as I used to be in these crazy times, but if I could be helpful for anybody's work, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you, and thank you for your exciting and stimulating presentation. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you again.